Why is eating local important? How does it affect you locally, globally?
Well, I didn't think about the importance of local food when I was young until I got sick. And I started looking at the agricultural system as we've come to know it. I'm a farm girl from old-fashioned kind of farming, and my father was an agricultural teacher. He taught practicum to students before they went to university, and they lived with us. So I grew up around production of food for not just humans but for livestock. And we had a very diverse farm of animals as well as crop. And so it was a normal and natural thing in the environment that I grew up in Wales. But I just went along with the flow as a young woman and was eating what we all did. And in my early 30s, I got very ill, and that's when I really started to focus on not being ill again and looking at the food system that was producing the food that I was eating and seeing the relationship between industrial agriculture and my health, and then moving from that into looking at industrial agriculture and the state of the planet, and realizing that if the state of the planet needed to be improved, that the condition of environments needed to improve, that our industrial agricultural system had to shift, and that we had to move into a healthier way of producing food. The industrial system produces food that tastes like industrial food. It doesn't taste like food should taste, and it doesn't carry the nutrient body that soil like this produces. The soil is what feeds the plants, and the quality of that soil produces a quality of plants that in turn feeds the quality of a life that we have, the strength and nutrients that our bodies need to be well. And for me, they're intimately tied. You cannot separate soil from plant from human health or environmental health. They're so knit together, and it's the separating of those things that is causing a tremendous amount of really unhealthy global issues, both from a human and a planetary point of view.
What is your relation to the importance of local food? Are you educating, supporting, consuming?
All of the above. I first came to Patagonia in 1993, and that was to start a project called the Tree of Life Rejuvenation Center, which is a way of approaching health through food and the quality of food. It's a raw food, vegan community, and part of my role there was to do all the site work for that project, which was a startup retreat center, but to also create a food system that would support the people living on that site plus the guests. And so that's where my food system work began in Patagonia, and it has been really important to me to inspire people to possibility here. So I started and ran the community garden in Patagonia for 10.5 years as a volunteer project, and we planted an orchard there. It's one of several orchards that I've planted here, so that we're not just planting ornamental trees, but we're planting trees that are both ornamental and productive. And I wanted people to know that we could do a lot here, despite the fact that not many people were doing it and thought it was impossible.
How does having such accessibility in this food market have a negative impact? Being able to buy whatever you please at the supermarket 24/7, 365 days.
Well, it seems like a satisfying idea to be able to walk into a supermarket and get whatever it is you want. But what we lose in that process is the lusciousness of a plant in its season, when it's doing its best. And if you look around this space right now, we are in southeast Arizona in an exceptionally warm winter, but we have a greenhouse full of plants that are loving this time of the year. I see kale and turnips and chard and Asian greens and endive and on, lettuce and so on, that tastes unbelievable right now. And it's just packed full of minerals and vitamins and things that we need. And when we eat in season, we get a sense of flavor that you don't get when we're buying things that are pressed to grow in a season they don't belong. And it all started, I think, 100 years or so ago, when somebody was throwing a big party in New York. It was a big money affair, and they wanted raspberries. And they were taken across the country by train. And that was the beginning of this idea that we could eat whatever we wanted whenever we wanted it. And we could force things to produce under strange conditions to satisfy some idea we had in our mind. But we've lost in the process, what we've lost is flavor. And if you've ever stood under a plum tree during its season, when the plums are ripe and the bees can't wait to get into them and the wasps, and you pull off that fully ripe, fully sugared fruit and you taste it, the perfume, the juiciness, it's unbelievable. And if you have a tree like that, you gorge yourself until you cannot eat another thing, and you satiate those desires, and every year you get to look forward to that cycle again, that month or 6 weeks when you can feast on that kind of flavor, that kind of intensity. And when you go to the supermarket and buy a plum, there is absolutely no comparison to that. It's like kissing someone when you're in love versus being kissed by someone you don't really like.
In your opinion, where did the shift in food come from? How did it happen? From home growing local to now modified, processed, genetically modified, and imported?
Well, that's a very big question, and it seems to have really taken a shift post-World War II, along with a lot of other things. We had, at the end of World War II, there were a lot of factories that were no longer producing war munitions or war equipment that were empty. There were a lot of chemicals that were used to create bombs in the war. And what happened as the war wound down and people returned home, people were growing food in this country to support that effort. In Britain, a huge percentage of the food produced in Britain was produced in victory gardens. It's where it started. And something like 40 or 50% of the food in Britain at that time was being produced in people's small garden plots. So for me, that's an example of what can be done and what we can return to. But those war chemicals were converted into fertilizers and pesticides. So in a sense, we're continuing the energy of a war by making war with the food that we eat, by using these same chemicals that are converted to grow food. This is how people can turn chemical fertilizers into bombs, because that's where they originated. So it seems that is where that shift began, the conversion of these chemicals into producing agriculture, and how industry then started to take over from the farmers. 85% of the farmers in the United States, when they returned from the war, left their rural communities and became urban people. And so we used that same technology for building barracks in World War II to build urban, suburban environments that we see proliferated. And we moved people off the farms into urban centers. And we also touted in the early part of last century, so in the early part of the 1900s, we started to automate things. So we took people who were craftspeople, who were skilled artisans, who knew the whole process of producing a product of any kind, and we took those apart. We sort of dissembled that thinking into being able to reproduce those products on a factory conveyor belt. Each person was taught to do one component. So we lost the wholeness of that. And this is sort of underlies part of this. And people then for every 100 people you wanted in the factory, on the factory floor, you had to have something like 940 interviews, because only 100 people out of that 940 would be able to tolerate the kind of work that a factory floor needed. And so at that time also, these are sort of pieces building onto this food system. At that time also, people had been taught that being indebted was a bad thing. To have debt was not a good quality. Now people were taught that being indebted was a good thing, that you were worthy to have debt. And so the stage was beginning to be set to keep people on a factory floor, to make them indebted by getting them to buy things that they didn't really need, which kept them at the factory table producing things even though they didn't really care for that work because it wasn't stimulating anymore. And so you see a system that's being laid down to put people in sort of an industrial cog as part of the system. And it translated after the war into food. Less people wanted to do farm work, more people wanted to have urban jobs. They saw it as a more attractive lifestyle, and less hard work and more predictable. But that pendulum has really swung so far the other way that we're now seeing people who have lost their ability to know how to grow food, and you actually see children who don't even recognize food. 6 and 7-year-old children, when Jamie Oliver holds up a potato in a classroom and asks the children, "What is this?" These children don't recognize that basic piece of food called a potato. And there's something quite shocking about moving from a country that was based in agriculture into a country that's industrialized its food system so extremely so that children don't recognize where food comes from. It's a pretty frightening state of affairs. And I'm not sure if I fully answered that question.
No, it's yeah. Yeah, you totally answered that question. Freeways in southern Arizona carry 40% of North Americans' food in from Mexico. How do you feel knowing that 40% of our food comes from that one area?
Well, I find the numbers fairly staggering. I know that actually that number of 40% in the wintertime is a lot closer to 70 or 75% of all the winter produce coming in across the border at Mexico. And there are a number of things that I associate with that. One is that from a security standpoint, from a national security standpoint, it's a very bad idea. And my favorite example of this is in Britain. I go back to Britain again, when that volcanic eruption a few years ago happened in Iceland, and planes were grounded in Britain for a week. It was a bit of a challenge because 90 or 95% of all fruit in Great Britain and 50% of all vegetables are now brought in from outside of the country, from places like Africa. Well, the whole food system moving around on trucks is a bad idea from a carbon standpoint. From a food, noisy guys. They agree. From a food security standpoint, it's a foolish thing for any nation to depend on bringing a huge amount of its food needs across a border. And I do know that if there was to be a global pandemic, and in all the things that I've read, that at some point this will happen. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. One of the first things that will happen is that all traffic will come to a halt. Borders will be closed, planes will be grounded, and what are the citizens? Should we photograph those ducks now? What are you doing on there? Oh, you interrupting little beasts. So if we're dependent on that food coming in and we get closed down, then what? What happens? So in terms of food security or food sovereignty, crossing borders with food like that and those percentages just doesn't make any sense to me. I see where there's been a benefit to portions of the farmers or the growers in Mexico, but the benefit has moved into the industrial agricultural system. What has happened because of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which resulted in this kind of agriculture across our borders, actually put somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million subsistence Mexican farmers out of work on their own small farms, forcing them into urban centers, increasing the population density in places like Mexico City. But part of our border issue is this lack of employment in Mexico. Having worked in Mexico myself, I saw it down there firsthand and talked to people who moved across their own country to where I was working, looking for work. It's part of the pressure of traffic, human traffic across the border. And if there were more opportunities for Mexicans to grow their own food as they have forever, and there were more opportunities here for people to grow their own food, I think we'd see less pressure on the border, less need to manage the border the way we're managing it now, which is actually extremely detrimental, not just to the human populations, but to wildlife populations as well. So there's a lot affected by this. And fundamentally, I think it's an inappropriate approach to our food system for anyone.
Ignorance is bliss. Do you agree with this statement in regards to the food industry?
Well, I suppose you could think ignorance is bliss. If I don't know what I'm consuming, does it matter? But I would say, and looking at the state of health of people in this country and over the world, that are consuming the worst of our foods, the fast foods, the foods children get fed in school, which is the worst of our food, and the health crises in terms of obesity and diabetes. And I can say, because of my mid-60s years, and I look around at my peers at this age group that have been consuming foods that they really don't understand what they're eating and what they're putting in their bodies, their so-called foods, processed foods, I would say ignorance is far from bliss. Ignorance really is an avenue to a chronic state of health that doesn't serve individuals, nor does it serve a society, nor a country. When children cannot think or cannot learn because they can't sit still, or they're over-sugared or undernourished, and people consume vast amounts of calories because they're trying to find energy from something that can't possibly give it to them, because energy ultimately comes from good health, I'd say ignorance is anything but bliss.
How self-aware are you consciously when buying food? Do you read labels and where it comes from?
Absolutely. I'd say I've spent 35 years becoming incredibly conscious about food. When I was initially making this shift about my health and wanting to be as healthy and as vigorous as I could, and then understanding how our food system was really working behind the scenes. And I'm very grateful to Tom Robbins and his book in the 80s called Diet for a New America. It was a pretty shocking insight into the industrial agricultural system. And because I have these roots in an old-style agriculture, I knew that farming did not have to be that industrial model, because I was so intimate with the other kind of model. And I found it shocking, and I started to think about, if animals are treated cruelly and horribly, and we're energetic beings, and they're energetic beings, when I ingest that flesh, what is that doing to my body? I mean, these are sort of the profound questions that I moved into in thinking about that. I also realized that I didn't want to put pesticides and horribly fertilized plants into my system either. I was grateful to a biologist by the name of Barry Commoner, who was very outspoken many years ago. And he talked about, well, you know, how this chemical might be evaluated and how much of this particular chemical you can have in your body and it's acceptable. These chemicals weren't being applied by themselves. There were multitudes of chemicals. Strawberries are one of the most pesticided and fungicided plants that we consume as our grapes. There's something like, or there were at least 170 some pesticides and fungicides used in the production of strawberries. And if you have numerous chemicals interacting within your cells at the same time, it's very different than the one that's been tested on its own. And all these tests were done in the male body, an adult male body, not in a female body or in a child's body. And so there's a different thing to be aware of. And every time I buy something in a package, which I try to avoid most of the time, is I read labels. If there are words on there I don't recognize, they don't get purchased by me. I grow, as you might see, I grow as much of my own produce as I can. I buy meat locally. Our ducks, which you can hear, are egg layers, and that's one of the reasons I have these ducks. They're pest control. They're my pest control system. They're my entertainment, but they also lay eggs, and they have a healthy life. And we buy whole grain. We buy whole organic grain. We grind that flour, and we make our own bread. So we're deepening. Every year that goes by, I try to add in one more layer of locally produced, and this year I'm trying a small patch of spelt grain myself to see what it will take for me to produce my own grain, and next year perhaps some of the grain for the ducks.
How can eating local become popular without just becoming another food fad?
Well, I think it's happening. I think something has shifted, and in part, I'd say this difficult economy that we've been through since 2008 has played a significant role. And by that, I mean that people are finding this is a difficult financial time. People who would normally be able to go out and eat at restaurants or go to the market and buy all that fast food are recognizing that it's costly, and that the only way you can get around high cost and get to high quality food is actually grow some yourself. And that when we find that there's a pleasure in that as an activity, and we can think of well, if I have X amount of dollars, I can actually go out to the farmer's market and pay somebody who's grown this food for myself. But if I don't have that kind of money, maybe I can learn to grow it myself. Maybe I can discover that I don't need to work that extra 10 hours a week to pay somebody else to do something that I can do in my time. It gives me pleasure, and not only gives me pleasure, but improves the quality of my life, because there's something very pleasurable about connecting with the earth. And I see that with children, the love that children have for putting seeds in the ground, and the magic of watching something emerge from that kind of effort. And I think there's a hunger in people. We've sort of swung to the extreme of letting others do things for us, and we've lost somehow that sense of empowerment that comes with producing and servicing your own needs to a considerable extent. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to be able to pay somebody else to grow your food if it's not who you are, but instead, what about the idea of others coming together to do it? It's something we do here. This is more than I can do by myself in this greenhouse, given all the other things that I'm involved in. So we have a little collective of women that are working together to do this. And it's fun. It's a way of finding social time together, of doing something meaningful that's pleasurable, and nourishing each other. And I find that as people are less afraid of this, and by helping people learn how to do this, that they then feel empowered to step out and do it themselves. And I also think that what if there was one person for every 10 households in numerous communities where one person might be the person who creates a little growing community, and the other people surrounding them, the other 9 families, pitch in with that effort, and everybody shares the result of that work. What if that was a model that was undertaken in neighborhoods and community places? It's also a great way for people to earn a little extra money at a difficult time. And I think the pleasure of that, reintroducing it as not as work, but as part of living, might be a shift. We just need to rethink how we see it. It's not drudgery for me to do this work. It's pleasurable. Sometimes it's a real effort, but if others are coming to join you, the effort gets diminished by that sense of community, of sharing the work as opposed to doing it yourself. Influence?
How does media hold influence of our food
Yeah, that's
choices?
a good one.
How does media hold influence of our food choices?
It has total influence on our food choices. Like, media has influence on everything we do. That's its purpose. So every year the food industry, and it's an industry, let's realize that it's industrial, comes out with something close to 2,000 new food products every year. And their whole aim is to make money off it. If we were to look at marketing budgets for anything, you would understand the absolute importance of media. Many years ago, I was working in a different world, and it was in the late 80s, and a woman I worked with told me about her son, who worked for an advertising agency, one of the big firms, and he had produced some of the most significant advertising. In fact, it was the Energizer Bunny idea was his. And he was so successful, this 30-year-old man, that he was offered a job with the advertising firm to move to Paris to work there. And this is the late 80s, and this is how important advertising is. He was offered $30,000 a month, to move to Europe and to work at this advertising firm. And if that doesn't tell us the story about the importance and the influence of marketing, I don't know what does. That someone can be paid at that point of time, at that age, that much money to sell people on the idea of buying goods, that kind of sums it up for me. It's a massive influence. The budgets for selling us things that people want us to buy. So that I'll stop there.
Why are people so disconnected around their food?
Well, I think we got turned into this consumer world. It was a deliberate post-World War II decision by one individual male of our species who said, we need to become a consumer society. So if you look at programs, television programs like Mad Men, whose whole focus was on how to sell people on something that they need, getting people to think they have a need so that they buy the products that manufacturers were manufacturing. We were sold on a lot of things, conveniences for preparing food, and my husband, Richard, is a product of that world. He grew up as one of 5 children, and his mother hated to cook. And it was 1952 when he was born, and he was brought up on TV dinners and TV trays and TV. It was convenient. He said they were stacked in his refrigerator like cordwood. And we got into the idea of how easy it was, processed food. We were sold it was easy, all these modern conveniences. But when you actually look around, I'd say we have lots of modern conveniences, but we don't have any more time. So that whole theory is a bust. And I think somewhere that programming has been perpetuated now for 50 years, 60 years, 65 years almost, that the idea that fast food, easy food, we shouldn't have to work to prepare food. We lost the idea of the pleasure of making great food, of the deliciousness of homemade food in convenience. But if you go to the store and you buy foods, as Michael Pollan will say in his book cooked, and you buy, Thai food or Italian food or French food, when you actually get past the first couple of bites, they all start to have this uniform flavor. And so we've traded something rich and delicious for what we thought might be convenient, which actually has proved not to be, but has actually become something that's slowly poisoning us over time. It's depleting our own energy resources, our own health, our own vitality, and we think it's easy, but what is it really? It's a question in my mind. And I think it's that. It's been a marketing tool, and part of what we need to do is shift that into a different mindset.
What is your knowledge regarding Monsanto?
The big beast on the planet, Monsanto. Well, I think there's a global awareness really been becoming a great wave around the planet as Monsanto becomes bolder and bolder. It is a multinational corporation. Its interest is in selling its product regardless of the impact on life on the planet. It would be useful to remember that Monsanto's been around for more than a century. It is a chemical company in large part servicing the agricultural industry. It was also the producer of Agent Orange. It was the producer of DDT. It's the producer of PCBs and agricultural animal growth hormones. I think if we understand that who and what Monsanto is about, it should tell us just about everything. Their concern is not the future of life on the planet, it's the future of the pocketbook of the owners and the shareholders of that company. If it is actually a publicly traded company, I'm not sure. Bottom line, Monsanto is the antithesis of a healthy food movement. So this is the PS.
Yeah, the
because
PS.
I think I forgot
the PS ending.
GMO part, the genetically modified organisms. I can see why that's a thought, why people think it's a good idea. But if you weigh a good idea of merging unrelated species or even related species and taking over a role that nature has played and evolved over millions and millions of years, I think we're playing with a fire that could get out of control that we don't understand. And anybody who's playing in this world, who has any sort of clout like Vandana Shiva or David Suzuki, if you listen to those voices, I'm in absolute agreement with their concerns of genetically modified trees, genetically modified food plants, genetically modified humans or animals. It's just one more step into that world of aberration. We don't know the results, but we do know that when genetically modified foods contaminate landscapes that are not genetically modified, and that farmers are getting sued for having those crops on their land when they've had absolutely nothing to do with it, there's something incredibly wrong with that. And so I am very much against GMOs in all its forms. I would not encourage it, period. I'm not interested in it, I won't consume it. I think it's a very, very bad idea.